When I decided to film today's video, I planned to make it somewhat historical and somewhat humorous, since we're talking about the Brezhnev era, the era of stagnation, the golden age of the Soviet Union. And I really wanted to show it to you from this, very interesting perspective. But then I saw the news that on January 20th, 2025, the United States of America will hold the inauguration of a new president. And it made me sad. Not because of the inauguration itself, but because I suddenly came to this realization that as long as the people of the Soviet Union are alive, as long as we are alive, nothing truly new will ever happen in the territories of the former Soviet Union. How is all this connected? Well, let's talk about that today. Hello, friends. My name is Julie, and you're watching Soviet Born, a channel where we tell you the whole truth about the Soviet Union that no one else will tell you. So stay with us, it's going to be very interesting. I won't go into too much detail about Leonid Brezhnev's biography. After all, who's really interested in all of that? What truly matters is that he's best remembered for the era when he was at the helm of the Soviet Union. He held the position of the country's top leader from 1964 until his death in November 1982. As it happened, I was born right around the time when Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev came to power. So all my childhood, all my youth, and my coming of age took place during this period. For the Soviet Union, this was the most wonderful period, even though they call it the era of stagnation. But it truly remained that era of stagnation that probably most Soviet people now long for. You really didn't have to think about anything. The country had already recovered from the war. A new generation had grown up and matured, the post-war generation. Light and heavy industry were developing, along with space exploration, aircraft manufacturing, the development of gas and oil fields that still feed Russia today. Everything, of course, including the 1980 Olympics and the Cold War. About Leonid Brezhnev, there's certainly a lot that could be said, but in modern times, if anyone remembers him, they probably remember him more from a humorous perspective. He was mostly known for his habit of kissing other state leaders. Even if someone doesn't remember him personally, they definitely remember his famous kissing photo with Erich Honecker, which I think everyone knows. And on top of everything else, he was quite an intelligent person, and even when he was quite elderly, he would joke that when he reads reports, if he starts skipping lines, nobody would notice. And few people know this, but he actually appealed to his family and to the leadership of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union to let him step down. But neither his family nor the party leadership would allow it, of course, because that was simply unacceptable. Regarding his family, there was certainly a corruption element, because the Brezhnev family lived in complete luxury, as you might say, and they had everything excellent, everything good. The Brezhnev name opened all doors, not just in the Soviet Union. As for the leadership, well, of course, it was about not giving people, I repeat, not giving people an example that a leader could change while still alive, rather than, as they say, being carried out feet first. You weren't supposed to leave your position by your own choice. That's kind of how it was. And so Leonid Brezhnev, of course, stayed until the end. And I'll say it again. For us, Brezhnev was the Soviet Union. That's all there was to it. So how did we actually bury Brezhnev? It happened in 1982, on November 7th, the biggest and brightest holiday for the Soviet Union, the birthday of the revolution, the birthday of the Free State. Leonid Brezhnev, as always, waved to all of us from TV screens at Red Square, surrounded by leadership, surrounded by foreign guests, and everything was in order. Everything was normal. On the 11th, we returned to school after the November holidays, and suddenly we noticed that we weren't being greeted by a teacher as usual. Normally, there was always a duty teacher meeting us at school to check that we were definitely there. We had a mandatory uniform that had to be exactly according to protocol, making sure we arrived at class and school on time, and all of this was monitored. I was already in high school then, we were upperclassmen, and when we entered, I'll say it again, we didn't see this familiar scene, the familiar composition of the duty teacher. We only saw, further up, as we were heading toward our classroom, that the school principal came out to meet us. We had a male principal, along with the vice principals and other teachers. They were all tearful, their eyes were all red, and they told us this: all upper classes should go to the assembly hall for an announcement, while all other classes should go to their classrooms. We gathered in the assembly hall, where I remember our principal announced that the most tragic moment in the life of the Soviet Union had occurred, that our leader, Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev, had passed away. They had just received official instructions on how we would bid farewell to him. We were told to return to our classrooms, where we would be given guidance on how to behave and instructions for saying goodbye. The principal asked us to remain calm and to proceed quietly back to our classrooms. In every Soviet institution, we always had a place called the Red Corner. And all Soviet schools had this red corner too, where there was a bust of Lenin and where all kinds of celebrations usually took place. So, as we were going up, passing by this corner, we saw our carpenter nailing up a huge portrait of Leonid Brezhnev with a black stripe above Lenin's bust. Two of our classmates were already standing on either side in their formal uniforms with two red flags. We were even surprised at how quickly this happened. They must have been notified in advance. So, we came to our classroom where our homeroom teacher stood before us. She was crying and crying, couldn't calm down at all. She was basically having a breakdown. But finally, she pulled herself together and told us that the Soviet Union would not work for 3 days. The country would be in mourning. And we, as senior students, were obligated to stand guard in memory of Leonid Brezhnev. This meant that during these 3 days, we had to take turns according to a list, coming to school in formal dress and relieving each other every 2 hours throughout the day beside this bust of Lenin under Brezhnev's portrait. And she told us our order according to the list. Plus, on top of everything else, no entertainment. We wouldn't be studying naturally for all these 3 days. The whole country didn't work for 3 days. During this time, we were required to read his works. I want to mention that the 3 most famous books in the Soviet Union that were published under Leonid Brezhnev's name were Minor Land, Virgin Lands, and Rebirth. These 3 books were everywhere, and we were required to read them, and we were also told that we should go home. These books were supposed to be in every home. Read these books and discuss all of this with our families. Now, when I remember all this, you understand what a surreal experience it was, right? If you think about it. And without fail, when we would watch, they had already announced there would be live television coverage of Brezhnev's funeral. We had to be in formal uniform, pioneers wearing their pioneer ties, Komsomol members in white clothes with their Komsomol badges. And when they would lower the coffin with our leader, we all had to stand up, shout, and give a salute. This is true. And we were told this would definitely be monitored. I don't know how exactly this was supposed to be monitored, but in general, this protocol of our behavior was explained to us and repeated several times. Well, and then, as our homeroom teacher told us, now look at the lists for your memorial watch duty. I still remember this, and go home. What was most important for young people then, as it always is in any time, was that there would be no studies, that we wouldn't have to go to school. My house was near the school, so I ran home to tell my mom the news. That day my mom wasn't working. She was also having a day off. I ran with the message because I knew for certain that she didn't know about it yet. I remember opening the door, and my sleepy mom comes out. She had just been napping, and says, "What's going on? Why are you here? Why aren't you in school?" And I remember these exact words that I said to her first. "Mom, Brezhnev is dead." You know, here we need to pause. Either I shouted it too joyfully, or perhaps because the words Brezhnev is dead were so forbidden. I remember my mother's eyes. I'll never forget them. They were probably the eyes of the Soviet Union at that moment, filled with such horror. There was such terror in her eyes, and she stood in front of me, grabbed my shoulders and said, "What are you saying? Do you understand what you're talking about? I'm going to call the police right now to have you taken away and arrested." I say, "Mom, what do you mean it's true? Brezhnev is dead." She says, "I'm telling you again, be quiet. I really will call the police to have you arrested and punished. You're a Komsomol member. You can't say such terrible things." I say, "Mom, turn on the radio, Mom. Turn on the TV. Look." It finally dawned on my mom that instead of shaking me and trying to bring me to my senses, it would be easier to just turn on some source of information. She went to the TV, and when she turned it on, what every Soviet person dreaded happened. The ballet was being broadcast. And you know, for all 3 days, they showed Swan Lake on TV. And that's why to this day, I'll digress a bit here, to this day, any person from the Soviet Union, if they turn on the TV and see a ballet playing, any Soviet person would know from those times that something had happened, that someone had died. I think even now there are jokes going around like, when will they finally show us the ballet on TV? But this is, of course, just a small side note. So anyway, my mom turned on this ballet, turned on the TV, saw this ballet, but she couldn't understand what was happening then. She went and turned on the radio, and on the radio they were announcing, began broadcasting around the clock that such and such a sorrowful event had occurred. Our leader, Leonid Brezhnev, had died. Of course, I remember all these preparations. Naturally, I also went according to schedule to this memorial watch. Moreover, I remember when everyone gathered around their TVs to watch Brezhnev's funeral, which was broadcast live. I'll tell you honestly, I didn't put on any white blouse with a red Komsomol badge. And I think many others didn't either. I remember that moment, which was truly terrifying, because right when they were broadcasting Leonid Brezhnev's funeral, and when the coffin was actually lowered with that thunderous sound, we'll show you this moment now, with that crash when the coffin fell, and when the Soviet anthem began to play, I remember how we heard this rumble from all windows everywhere. We heard the signals. Our factory was sounding its horn, passing cars were honking, the power plant was blaring. Through all our windows came this rumble, this noise, because across the entire Soviet Union there was this memorial drone. That's how we buried Brezhnev. That was the situation. Back then, as I remember, what made Soviet times so different from now was that people's lives were arranged so that they didn't need to think about anything at all. Everything was decided for them. All that was required of you was to work and not stick your nose where it didn't belong. We lived in a closed space, in absolute vacuum. If you compare Soviet life to something today, it can be clearly compared to life in North Korea, because we literally don't know what's happening in North Korea, right? Neither you nor we know. And it was exactly the same. Nobody knew what was happening in the Soviet Union, because we were such closed-off people and were raised in such a way that we weren't even interested in knowing. And most importantly, it was, of course, about the leaders, the party leaders. The thing is, no one ever questioned the idea of changing leaders. There was Brezhnev. He was alive, saying something, leading something. We had no war, we had food on our tables, we had places to go, we were given housing. And somehow no one thought about the fact that everything was dictated to us. Where to study, where to work, even what to eat and what to wear. Because we truly all lived like identical people. Of course, during this time, corruption began to flourish. Bribery began to thrive. Because if the leader himself who ran the country sat in his position permanently, then every little boss also considered himself irreplaceable. And so, resolving any issue, I remember this even now, whether getting a good job, seeing a good dentist, obtaining a good vacation voucher, you absolutely had to give something, bring something. Even in the smallest position, every supervisor would act like some huge important figure before whom you had to bow and beg for favors. I'm telling you all of this so you can understand how people had become so deeply accustomed to living this particular way for nearly 20 years, that any change, you understand, would cause tremendous anxiety. Let me tell you a story from recent times to project this situation onto modern life. Several years ago, I was traveling, and it so happened that while I was sitting at the airport, an elderly woman approached me. She came up to me with her suitcase and said, "Please, would you be able to watch my bag? I need to go to the ladies' room." I responded, "Yes, of course, please. I'll sit here with it." She went away and then came back, thanked me, and we began talking. She was flying from Russia to Kazakhstan for her granddaughter's wedding, as she explained to me. I said, "How wonderful that you're flying to a wedding." She responds, "What's so wonderful about it?" "The trip," she says, "was paid for by my daughter, but for my granddaughter's wedding gift, I even had to dip into my funeral money." Let me briefly explain to you what funeral money is. Our pensioners, in principle, they all save money for their own funerals. This tradition has been carried over from times long past, so as not to heavily burden their relatives, because once again, the constant shortage of money forces our elderly people to save even for their own funerals. So, to get back to where I was, she says, And I had to dip into my funeral money just to give her some kind of wedding present. I say, "Is your pension not enough?" She responds, "How could the pension ever be enough? You have to choose. Pay for utilities or buy medicine, there's never enough money. I economize on food, I economize on transportation, I economize on everything." And I say to her, "Well, there were elections recently." And I say, "Who did you vote for?" She responds, "For Putin." I say, "But how could you vote for Putin? If you're saying yourself that the pension is small, life is bad, everything is terrible, why did you vote for him then?" She says, "My dear." And here she looked at me with such telling eyes and says, "My dear, well, you see, we know him already, but what if it gets even worse?" And that's when you understand this is the absolute truth about people. Yes, that any change, even if you're living in terrible conditions, any change whatsoever is frightening. And this was truly and deeply ingrained in us since the Soviet times. The Soviet Union collapsed and numerous independent states were formed. But the leaders, the people remained exactly the same. The same Lukashenkos, the same Nazarbayevs or Putins. All of them, accustomed to living precisely from those times, having power in their hands, you understand, none of them will ever voluntarily give up their power. And the people who came from the Soviet Union, still living in this mindset, they are terrified of this change of power. And our leaders, they simply take advantage of this fact, you understand. This is the psychology of the former Soviet Union leaders. You either have to make the decision to leave voluntarily. If you want to, you understand, just like Yeltsin did, or just like Nazarbayev did, whether for health reasons or for some other reasons. Or you have to be carried out feet first, you understand. No one will ever, under any circumstances, willingly give up this power. And if by chance any leaders appear in our former Soviet states who actually decide to live according to the law, then war begins. That's all there is to it. Because they're all afraid, they're terrified of this trigger. You understand? The trigger that we might be able to live differently, that power should actually change hands according to the law. As just a simple woman, I don't know how clearly I've managed to explain my thought, but when I saw the news today about the inauguration of the President of the United States of America, about truly free elections, I understood that we will never have anything like this. Never. Until all heads of state begin to follow the law, begin to follow the Constitution. Until then, there will be no normal governance in our countries. Because despite everything, despite any conditions whatsoever, the law must be followed. Power must change hands through proper channels, and only then will people finally begin to get used to and live in a new way. When I remember the Brezhnev era, when I especially remember Brezhnev's funeral, I reflect as a simple woman, as an ordinary person, and everything I've told you today is truly my personal opinion. But it pains me to realize, and it hurts to understand, that the Soviet Union, of course, no longer exists. The Soviet Union broke apart into many independent states. Nevertheless, the very concept of the Soviet Union, the actual political system of the Soviet Union, it has remained in people's minds, it has remained in people's lives. People are so terrified of changes, people are so completely unaware of what positive changes could be, because many of us, myself personally, we didn't just live through the Soviet Union, we lived through the collapse of the Soviet Union, which plunged us into poverty, threw us into all kinds of turmoil. Many people died, many people lost everything they had. And therefore all of this has crystallized into precisely this fear, to at least preserve what little you have. And so the leaders of these states, these independent states of the former Soviet Union, you could say, probably take advantage of perhaps this human condition. And again, I keep thinking about this woman saying, what if it gets worse? Indeed, each and every one of us thinks, what if it really does get worse? Better to leave things as they are. Although, of course, this is completely the wrong position to take. And when I saw the news today about the inauguration of another president of the United States of America, when I read news from Europe, when I generally read news from what we call the so-called free world, regardless of whether you personally like the elected president or not, whether you like this or that particular party, but you have a choice. You truly have a real choice. You can truly participate in making that choice. You have this opportunity. And most importantly, you're not afraid of making this choice. But our people, they live in constant fear. Therefore, I'll say it once again, as long as the Soviet person continues to exist, as long as we continue to live in our states with this mindset, it's highly unlikely that anything will truly change. And it's even more unlikely that anyone who simply came to power, as the leaders of these numerous states have now come to power, will simply give it up voluntarily. Either they will begin to live by the law, and then we too will gradually get used to this and will learn to live by the law. Or they will continue to sit firmly in their positions and simply take advantage of our deeply ingrained fear. That's all there is to it. For me personally, this is an extremely brave video to make, and I honestly don't even know myself how I found the courage to make it. So I sincerely ask you to support me. Please like, subscribe, repost, and of course leave your comments. Your comments mean so very much to me. I want to say that my decision to talk about this with you came about most likely only thanks to this channel, thanks to the Soviet-born channel, when I first started filming for this channel and began to understand that behind those phone and television screens are people just like us. Understanding, kind and responsive people. And it's only thanks to your supportive comments that I find this courage within myself to speak out. Thank you so very much for this. I sincerely hope you will continue to watch our channel. When I look at the documentary footage from Leonid Brezhnev's funeral, at all this enormous grandeur, at this power, I'm reminded of the words of the great Byzantine Empress Theodora. The purple of power is better than the shroud. Indeed, who would give this up? No one. This was Julie with you, Soviet-born channel.